This Freedom Stories discussion is being recorded for use by the International Storytelling Center, ISC. This recording will be owned and managed by ISC and will be used for any educational purpose that ISC deems appropriate. By participating in this public discussion, you acknowledge this recording and its subsequent uses. Closed captioning is provided today by ACS. Freedom Stories, Unearthing the Black Heritage of Appalachia is proudly supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities and produced by the International Storytelling Center.
All alive, and the magic colors afternoon. I am Alistine Turley, Director for the International Storytelling Center Freedom Stories Project. Welcome to today's discussion of Melungeons in Appalachia, the criminalization of race. Freedom Stories is an International Storytelling Center initiative designed to illuminate underappreciated, ignored, and neglected aspects of African American Appalachian history. Freedom Stories brings together the folk art of storytelling and the humanities scholarship with the intent of guiding the public through a deeper appreciation of the role of African American stories in the creation of American culture we experience today. Conceived as a regional program based in Central Appalachia, the project is recorded and the presentations serve as a resource for the nation and the world. We're eager to highlight the diversity of our Appalachian communities, the complexities of Appalachian histories, and the role the region has played in U.S. history, all of which has been subject to misunderstanding and misinterpretation. The International Storytelling Center is fortunate to be able to provide these important discussions through the generous support of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is the major funder of the Freedom Stories Project. Today's discussion is recorded, and along with all Freedom Story discussions, will be made available to the public on YouTube, the International Storytelling Center webpage, and Facebook page. I would encourage our viewing audience, if you have questions or comments for me or for the panelists, to text them to our Facebook page, and we will try our best to get to as many as time permits. Today marks the last public discussion we will host this year. Currently, we plan to begin our 2021 discussions Saturday, January 9th, 2021. Please check the International Storytelling Center webpage for the most up-to-date program details regarding our 2021 stories. We are pleased to begin today's discussion, as we always do, with the benefit of a storyteller. And today, we are fortunate to be joined by a nationally recognized author and storyteller, Lynette Ford, who has agreed to share a few of her family stories with us today. Lynn Ford is a fourth-generation storyteller, author, and teaching artist. Her work is rooted in the gifts of her Appalachian family heritage of folktales and personal stories. Lynn put these stories into print in her first two collections under the titles of Appalachian Tales and Beyond the Briar Patch, which are both winners of the Ann Izzard Storyteller's Choice Awards. Lynn's work has taken her to schools and conferences, correctional facilities, and women's retreats across the United States and the world, including Australia, Ireland, and by virtue of the Zoomiverse, Germany, Singapore, and South Korea. Following Lynn's presentation, I'll rejoin you to introduce our other panel members for today's discussion. But for right now, let's listen to the presentation of stories by our featured storyteller, Lynn Ford.
Thank you. I want to share story in picture a little bit for you first. That's me, that little round-headed child. And I think my head is as big now as it was then. And that's my mama, Jean E. Arkward Cooper Matthews. Now, my mother went to school at Howard University, and the family was thrilled that she went there. And she got a degree in music and came back to her home in the Appalachian region of Western Pennsylvania, Mercer County. And she couldn't get a job. Not because she'd done anything wrong. Not because her grades were poor, because they were top of the class, but because of who she was. No school would hire her as a music teacher, and there weren't dance studios She probably would have done better to go to New York City or some other big city, but she wanted to stay where family was, and she wanted to help the folks that were in that valley. When she couldn't get work as a teacher, and she couldn't find much work as a singer with an operatic voice, except solos at church, my mother eventually became a registered nurse and eventually the assistant director of a community for elders. And when she retired from there, that beautiful voice was gone. The music was gone. Her joy was still there, but my mother was not who she might have been just because of what someone else thought she was. This is a picture of her mama, my grandma, Jean. And it turned out Jean was not really her name. She didn't like her name, which was Emma Jean Jessamine Wilson. And so in the family Bible, she just crossed that name out and put Elizabeth Jean. So every firstborn girl in the family had the name Jean. My mother was Jean Elizabeth, is Jean Elizabeth. I'm Lynette Jean. There's an Audrey Jean, a Sandra Jean. That wasn't her name. So we're all named Jean, and that name's just in the Bible and was in her heart, but that wasn't her name. She thought the other name would be an embarrassment. She thought the other name was something folks wouldn't accept because it sounded too country. Now, my grandma could play the piano. She also played saxophone in a jazz band way back when. And that piano she played when the movies had no sound, no music, other than what she made playing on the keys on that piano. But her children could not sit on the first floor where the piano was. They had to sit in the balcony. And if there weren't too many people around who might notice, my mother told me that Grandma would let them sneak down and sit beside the piano, and it was hard to see the movie, but they were on that first floor and close to their mama. Still, she couldn't use her music. She couldn't use her voice, and she died of cancer of the throat without becoming the one she might have been. These are two of my favorites in the family. You see my pop-pops with the dark hair, and my great-pops, his father, my great-grandfather. And I always thought great-pops looked a little bit like Abraham Lincoln with white hair. But they were stonemasons, and they lived in a part of Ohio where they could have worked on the pottery that was being made in the capital, the pottery capital, East Liverpool, Ohio. However, because of who someone decided they weren't permitted to work there. Pop-Pops worked in coal mines. He was trained as an engineer, but they wouldn't let him run the train. Eventually, he worked in the steel mill. He still worked on the rails a bit, but not in charge of anything. And Great Pops could build a wall so fine that it looked like the beginning of a castle. And yet he would never be hired by anyone who would need those skills because he claimed who he was instead of what somebody might think. He had no question about who he was, but that kept him from getting some work. He died of cancer, never being able to run his own business because he didn't have support to start it. And that bit about the pottery, well, there were folks of Italian heritage who couldn't work in the pottery mills either, too close to being Black. And it turned out to be a good thing because the dust in those pottery mills got into the throats and the lungs of the men who worked in them. And they died from diseases and conditions of that dust, while the Black folks and the brown folks thrived. Still, folks held them back from who they could have been. And the last picture, this is a picture of my favorite storyteller, my daddy. Now, he was considered a red bone. Red having to do with the color of his skin as well as the color of his hair, and his eyes were a kind of a hazel color. His mama had the same coloring, and so did my sister. My daddy was a second lieutenant in the Tuskegee Airmen's last graduating classes, and their battle was to integrate the troops. But he had other knowledge besides flying a plane. He could tell you about the weather, and he had certification for that. But when he came back to that valley in Appalachian, Pennsylvania, he couldn't get a job as a weatherman on the radio. Now, who was going to see him on the radio? And he had a smooth radio type voice that would have worked beautifully, kind of somewhere between Barry White and Marvin Gaye. But he couldn't get a job as a weatherman on the radio. And he couldn't get a job flying planes for any airline. And he ended up working in a steel mill and at a gas station to help his mama and to support his family. And he always worked 2 jobs, but he never became what he might have, because it seemed like a crime, like a sin to someone, that he was who he was. And he wasn't ashamed of that, not at all. He was very happy being who he was. He told me, some folks will say who they are, but they really don't know. And some folks know who they are, but they really won't say. I want you to know who you are and be who you are. Well, actually, in the story, he said, be who you is, not who you ain't. And I didn't understand the importance of that, not then, because I was a little girl. One day, I went to school in the new neighborhood where we lived. We had moved from the flats, the lowlands, up onto the hill. Now, neighborhoods were slightly integrated. Schools were integrated, but I was the only child of any color in my class. And I was teased about it, and I didn't know why. And one day, a girl called me that word, that name. And I had no idea what it meant, and I didn't know why her friends were snickering, and I was too ignorant to be angry. So I went home from school that day, and my father was sitting at the table getting something to eat between his 2 jobs. And I just asked him, Daddy, what's up? My father turned 3 different shades of red. And he glared at me, and I could see his jaw clenching, and I thought I'd done something wrong. And then he said, I don't ever want to hear that word come out of your mouth. That is not who you are. And you don't let somebody else give you a name. That's not who you are. And then he told me a story. And the story has a connection to somebody else who's going to be speaking here too. But I didn't know that at the time. It was just what I thought was a legend from my daddy, something that he'd made up. He told me about a boy who had been given the name Josephus. Had he been in West Africa, that would not have been his name. And at the age of 10, he was sold to a man in the area across the river from Marietta, Ohio. The man ran a ferry, and Josephus was to work for him without pay, without respect. And the ferry would go across that river, and Josephus watched how it worked. And the man told him, no point in you looking at what I'm doing, because you're not going to be able to do the work. You're too stupid to know what to do. Josephus was 10 years old, and 5 years passed, my daddy said, and Josephus was now a teenager. And he said to that man, Sir, I can make the ferry go. I'm bigger and stronger, and I know what to do. I know how to pole it across the water when it's muddy, and I can pull it when it needs to be drawn across the river. I could do the work. And the man told him no. You're too stupid to know what to do. Just do what I tell you to do. Help folks on the ferry and put on their bags. Help them off on the other side and put their bags down for them. Just do that. That's all you can do. And Josephus put his head down. He didn't say anything. But my daddy said 5 years later, Josephus was still working for that man. And he said to him, sir, you getting kind of old, and I'm bigger and stronger now. I can make the ferry go all by myself, and you could take yourself a rest. And the man told him, no. You're too stupid to know what to do. You just do what I tell you to do. Help folks get on the ferry. Put their bags on the ferry. Help them off on the other side and put their bags down on the other side. Don't ask me to do anything more because you're too ignorant to do anything else. You're too stupid. My daddy said Josephus was big, strong, looked good. And he could have knocked that man down. But if he did, he'd be punished and others might be punished too. So he just put his head down. And then my daddy said one day a man came from across the river, went down river, and then came around and back to that place next to the water. And there was Josephus standing next to the ferry, and that old ferryman was asleep at the side of the water. And that man said, Josephus, get on the ferry. I'll help you to take it across the river so that you can find your freedom. I can help you with it. You know what to do. And Josephus said, well, sir, I don't know about that because, see, I've been told I'm too stupid to know what to do. But late at night, when it gets a good bit dark, I must get a little bit smarter because I've been helping folks run away across this here part of the river since I was a boy. And that man ain't caught me yet. So I'm just going to keep on staying here, helping folks to cross the water. I know who I am, even though he calls me stupid. I'm Josephus. And when I feel like I've done enough, I'll take the ferry over there myself and be free. And my daddy said that's what Josephus did. One morning, the ferryman woke up and his ferry was on the other side of the Ohio River. And daddy said, now you remember what I told you. And I know I said, yes, sir, because that's what I was supposed to say. He said, you remember that an adjective like stupid is not your name. Now, I thought that was one of my daddy's legends, something that he had made up. And as I got older, I remembered it. I thought it was to make me feel good. And then I was in Belpre, Ohio, getting ready to do some storytelling. And I had taken a break in the library and talked with the librarian, and she brought me some of the work of Mr. Henry Robert Burke. May his name live on. And as I looked at that work, stories of the Underground Railroad, stories of the area, stories of Marietta, there was the name Josephus. And I felt a chill go up my spine, and even talking right now, I can feel the goosebumps rising all over my body. And I know I sat there looking at that name and crying because there was a historical connection to my father's story. Legend is wonderful, but realities give you a foundation in who you are, a foundation that you can live and carry to others, a foundation that lets you know that your life matters and that an adjective like stupid is not your name. I share these stories to honor my family and to honor all the elders. That area of southeastern Ohio was a place where many of the Melungeon heritage helped people to escape on the Underground Railroad. They were an essential part of that because of who they were and how they looked. And nowadays we can honor them. But ages ago, folks called them something else. Remember who you are. Look for who you are. Claim who you are. And if you have to, give yourself a name. And that's the end of my stories. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I enjoyed those. I've written a couple of those down to use. So now I'm pleased to introduce the other members of our discussion today, beginning with the Assistant Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Marietta College, Director Tony Mail. Hi, Tony. Tony was born and raised as part of a Morgan County, Ohio Melungeon community, which has existed in Morgan County for several generations. He is a first-generation high school graduate and is currently finishing his doctorate in counselor education from Ohio University. Tony is involved in genealogy as a means of aiding people in finding themselves, using the wisdom of the elders. He is the proud father of two beautiful teenage girls who love discussing their family history. Over the years, Tony has remained active in Morgan County history, including preservation of the work of someone you heard Lynn just mention, Henry Burke. One of the great, I had the pleasure of meeting Henry when he was really cranking out the work on the Underground Railroad there in Morgan County in Southern Ohio. So appreciative of everything he's done, and so glad that the Multicultural Genealogical Center in Chesterfield is preserving and continuing to promote his work. Thank you for joining us today, Tony.
Well, thanks for having me. I just wanted to open up with a couple of quotes.
Let me introduce Wayne, and then I'm going to open it up to the panel. So our next panel member, we're also fortunate to have author, director of East Tennessee's Public Broadcast Radio, WETS-FM 89.5 on the dial. Is that how you do it, Wayne?
That's how we do it.
On your radio dial, joining in today's discussion. And so Wayne Winkler is not only the director of East Tennessee's Public Radio, he is also an author of two very popular books. His first, Beyond the Sunset, the Melungeon Outdoor Drama, 1969 to 1976, and the newly released Walking Toward the Sunset, the Melungeons of Appalachia, which was just released this year. Both books are published by Mercer University Press. And of Melungeon heritage, Wayne is committed to the continued exploration, preservation, and sharing of the Melungeon legacy in East Tennessee. So welcome, Wayne, and thank you for joining us in today's conversation.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'd like to begin the discussion today by just maybe going with you now, Tony, and everyone can stay unmuted for this because I want everyone in the conversation. Tony, can you begin by telling us how you were introduced to this topic of Melungeon history?
Well, it's an interesting question because I identify as Melungeon. Now, Melungeon, and again, when I tell you these family stories and tell you my perspective, keep in mind it's my perspective alone. We have many surnames in the area, and I can give you a list. I can show you a list. These are surnames in Ohio and West Virginia, Kentucky, Michigan, that all identify as Melungeon. And so the term Melungeon is quite complex. And you've seen in the PowerPoint earlier that the term referred to as not only Melungeon, Guineas. I have a whole list of names because we're very unique. Skin tone, hair texture, facial features, and so on and so forth. And one that always stood by me was not only Melungeon, but the term WINS, W-I-N-S. Now, keep in mind, as you seen earlier, the W stands for white, the I for Indians or Native American, and the N for Negro. So we have a mixture of all three. So what you'll have in my culture and other surnames is different identities. And you can even investigate that further by using biracial or triracial identity model on how these particular cultures or family members identify, self-identify. So I've always been Melungeon, and even though I'm a light complexion, I've always identified myself as a Black male. But I have close family members who identify the Native heritage that we have, which is Cherokee and Delaware. So Yeah, so I'm a firm believer in understanding. As you can see around me, you'll see on my shirt, you'll see the Sankofa. The Sankofa is a West African spiritual symbol. Now the bird is facing, his body's facing forward, his head's facing backwards, symbolizing in order to go forward, you have to know where you've been. You have to reach back and grab. And the bird also has an egg in its mouth. And all of you know egg is not just symbolizing dinner or lunch, it's also symbolizing life, symbolizing youth. Our children also have to know their ancestry and their history. And before we move on, I just want to tell you one quote by John Henry Clark. He was a Black historian in about 1960s and 70s. So his quote on history: history is a clock that people use to tell the political and cultural time of day. It is also a compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. History tells the people where they have been and what they have been, where they are and what they are. Most important, history tells the people where they still must go, what they still must be. The relationship of history to the people is the same as the relationship of a mother to her child. So history is really important.
Yes. And we hope to get into much deeper discussion of that history. But Wayne, share with our viewers how you were introduced to this topic of Melungeon.
My parents were part of the great Appalachian diaspora of the 1950s. They moved up to the industrial Midwest and took jobs building cars. And we kept coming back to Tennessee, though, 4 or 5 times a year. Anytime school was out, we'd come back to Hancock County, where my grandmother lived. And in the summer of 1968, we were there, and I was reading the local newspaper, and they were talking about the proposed outdoor drama that was going to be staged the following year in Sneedville, the county seat. And it was going to be about the Melungeons. Now, I was 12 years old. I thought I had a fairly decent vocabulary, but I had never heard the word Melungeon before. So I asked some of my relatives, who are these Melungeons? Why haven't I seen them? And some of the relatives weren't really eager to talk about it, but some of my relatives were involved in the outdoor drama, in the planning of it. And they were very eager to talk about it. And I found out that, my dad's family had Melungeon ancestry. So I thought, well, that's a great thing. But I believe it was that same summer I heard my grandmother described by a couple of very, very nasty terms. And that brought it to a different level. You'll kind of understand now why people didn't want to talk about it, why there was kind of a bad feeling about it, because there were people who had a very bad opinion about who the Melungeons were. I realized the subject was kind of a touchy one. A lot of people were like the relatives I had that didn't want to talk about it. In 1947, the Saturday Evening Post did an article about the Melungeons and Hancock County, and nobody was happy about it. Not the Melungeons, not the non-Melungeons. They all felt they had been portrayed badly. So I got curious about it. When I came back home, I went to the library and looked up what little available material there was. I read about the work of William Gilbert, Calvin Beale, Bruton Berry, Edward Price, Bonnie Ball, the basic library of information that was available at that time. And I would write papers at school about it whenever I had the opportunity. And those papers always got an A. And that was kind of a novel experience for me. And I thought that's the kind of positive reinforcement that makes you a Melungeon researcher. But I kind of put the subject down until I wound up moving to Tennessee for work. And I found that I'm in the same area as many of my relatives were still alive then. And this was an area where people knew about the Melungeons. They had heard of them. Maybe they didn't know much about them. And in 1994, Brent Kennedy published his book, The Melungeons, The Resurrection of a Proud People. That kind of coincided with the rise of the internet in the hands of ordinary people. And that led to a great deal of interest in the Melungeons. I covered the first Melungeon Union for National Public Radio and did a story on them and wound up becoming part of the Melungeon Heritage Association. I was able to write a couple of books about it, and I found that it just became something that I was very much involved in. And I did want to mention that Brent Kennedy passed away nearly 2 months ago. He had been the victim of a stroke back in 2005 and had not been very active. in public, but he was still always a wonderful man, and I want to thank him and recognize his work toward making the Melungeons well known around the world.
Awesome. That is Brent Kennedy's book. Whenever someone does mention the Melungeons, his name is usually the first name you hear when referencing the Melungeons. So I'm sure that book did a great deal in improving our knowledge base. But I'm also curious about the name Will Allen Drumgoole, because in reading up on this topic, her name comes up quite a bit. And I found out even a lot of the writers on Melungeon always referred back to her. So Wayne, was this a name you were familiar with?
Yes, Will Allen Drumgoole was a writer and a poet. She, as you had mentioned in the PowerPoint, she was qualified to be a lawyer, not allowed to practice. She had heard about the Melungeons, and in 1890, she made the trip to Hancock County, which was a very remote place for her to go. But she went there and stayed with the various families up and down the valley near Newman's Ridge. And then she wrote articles about them, first for the Nashville Sunday American, and then she kind of redid those articles for a national magazine, The Arena. And she was very, very negative in her portrayal of the Melungeons. She described them as shiftless, suspicious, just about every bad adjective you could think of, she applied to the Melungeons. And the people in Hancock County really resented what she had written about them. They referred to as Will Allen Damfool. And, they've really been bitter about what she has written, because her writing was the basis for what nearly everybody else wrote for nearly 100 years.
Right. And so I'm definitely, she's on my reading list now, because I'm curious about how many of her ideals still reflect in today's society. When you talk about triracial or multiracial people, these images have a way of hanging on throughout history, which we've learned. And Lynn, in your storytelling about your dad being a red bone, my mom was called a red bone. And honestly, I never understood the term until I began reading for this particular event. And just for my own history, learning that her family were considered red bone, I just thought that was a reference to their skin color and their hair color and their so that's a whole new realm of information for me to explore in terms of Melungeon culture. But how in your family do you celebrate Melungeon history as a group? Is this something you're going to write about going forward?
I'd like to write about it going forward. The reality in my family, however, is that there were the ones who were willing to be who they were, and the ones who passed and disappeared from the family. In fact, a portion of the family went to the British Isles in the hopes that none of their children would marry a person of color and the grandchild be a child of color. And my aunt was the one who told me that, and she was very angry about it. And she was actually working at a large department store in downtown Sharon, Pennsylvania as a hat model. Had they known she was Black, she wouldn't have gotten that job. And she said, as long as they don't ask, I don't tell. So there's a whole lot of history that I'm trying to gather. And the Melungeon aspect of it probably will be more from my father, who has very little family left, because he was the one who spoke of the Cherokee and Chickasaw and Choctaw parts of the family. And he was the one that told me there was this very small community, probably not there anymore, where the tracks went down the middle of the community. And on one side, the folks were Black, and on the other side, the folks were white, and they were all kinfolk.
Right.
And
Well,
so I'm trying to gather information.
after this is over, you and I will have to compare notes. I have a branch of my mother's side of the family in Pennsylvania who no longer identify as African Americans, and they have lived a long time. I don't want to out them on this program, but they're in Erie, Pennsylvania, and they've passed a long time as white. For a time, they were considered Italian, but they passed now totally as white, and they no longer really affiliate with our side of the family.
Mhm.
So you're right. You even within your own family connections, telling this history isn't always popular. But Tony, you're right there now. You're still connected to this story. And how do you think not knowing, Lynn talked a lot about not knowing who you are. How do you think it would be different in Appalachian? And I'll throw this question open to everyone. If we kind of approached history differently. For instance, let me share what I'm talking about. When I was in school, and it may not have been this way for you, but American history always began with British history. So I'm wondering if we would have been as confused about Melungeons if we had begun with Spanish exploration to better explain how we would begin in Appalachia with so many, with a triracial group.
Mhm.
Because when you know the history, it makes sense, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, if you look back at school system, a lot of history was left out. I remember one time studying Ohio history, the Underground Railroad was not discussed in that class as well. And Ohio has a very rich history related to the Underground Railroad, as well as Southeast Ohio. And what you'll find in many Melungeons were able to participate
Right,
because they were like complected.
right,
And they had roots, they had families in Ohio, and they had trust. But they were, now I'm not saying it wasn't dangerous, because it was dangerous work for them. I mean, they could still be beat or for that matter lynched, but they were able to assist. You have the Letts family, the Burke family, the Poke Patch region in Gallipolis and Chester Hill with the Quakers. What you'll find is a lot of former slaves stayed here, and they made connection with the natives in the area. So yeah, it would have been much different. I would say more respect and more understanding instead
right.
of being taboo.
Right. And our idea of, now convinced that our ideas of Appalachia and how they have formed over the century is based on misrepresented history. So again, we see the danger of not telling a full story, just telling one story. You miss a great deal of American history that really brings us to a better understanding, I think, of where we find ourselves today. So, what other implications do you think this story has for our moving forward in race relations? Even within our own families, if we're still struggling to be able to share this story, what do you think the implication is for the region for having this type of discussion? Dwayne, I'll start with you.
Oh, well, the history of the Melungeons it's a part of what actually happened in Appalachia, and to be left out of that history, it leaves everyone with an incomplete kind of a picture. The struggles of the Melungeons in Appalachia and elsewhere, it kind of has parallels with some of the things that we have going on today, and you realize some struggles never really end. A couple of examples. In 1845, in the congressional election in the 1st District of Tennessee, 8 men with Melungeon surnames were charged with illegal voting by reason of color. Some of these men had been in Tennessee for 40 years or more, but the original Tennessee Constitution granted all free men the right to vote. The revised Constitution restricted the vote to white men. So these men were put on trial. Some of them pled guilty and paid a fine. Others were acquitted, but none of them and no one else with Melungeon surnames tried to vote again until after the Civil War. Another issue that came up was in 1924, the Racial Integrity Act in Virginia. Of course, Hancock County is right up next to the Virginia state line, so this affected many Melungeon families. The Virginia law classified all citizens as either white or colored. There was nothing in between, nothing else. So the Virginia law was seen as a model for many other states. This was during the eugenics era. and many states passed similar laws, but Virginia's was seen as a model. The state defined who you were and what rights you had. That included which schools you could go to, what public transportation and accommodations you had a right to, who you could marry. The Racial Integrity Act, by the way, was not overturned until 1967 with the Supreme Court case of Loving versus Virginia.
Right.
So two of the biggest issues that we see in the United States today are voter suppression and the government's treatment of people of color. And this is something that has been going on for a long time.
A long time.
One of the things that Melungeon history demonstrates.
Well, and certainly, so what's history? The more things change, the more they stay the same. So we're still struggling with this idea of race in America, and the fact that so much of it began in the Appalachian region. For me, looking at this early American history and understanding that America has always had multiracial groups who were trying to find freedom any way they could, and how they spread out through the region. So Tony, in Southern Ohio, are there other Melungeon communities? We talked about Morgan County, but
Of course, yeah. And
how-
what you'll
Go
find
ahead, I'm sorry.
early is they still segregate. Now, of course, the segregation at the beginning was not self-segregation. They were forced by systematic racism, but even to this day, they still self-segregate. For instance, the Lett family still has the land in the original Lett settlement. In Chester Hill, there are still African Americans that live there, as well as Quakers, and in Poke Patch area. So even in Kilvert, which I didn't discuss Kilvert, but Kilvert was once called Tablertown. So how the story goes, Michael Tabler, his father owned slaves in West Virginia, of course, would have been Virginia at the time. Well, Michael fell in love with one of his father's slaves by the name of Hannah. And, they had a secret relationship for years, and they had children, and he just got tired of his family being in bondage. So he went to Ohio County, West Virginia, freed his family, and moved to Athens County and established a really nice community. It was called Tablertown. And in that region, you'll still have descendants of Michael and Hannah Tabler that still live in that region today. So we still self-segregate. And it's always interesting when I work within higher education, and when I hear Blacks in higher education that move to this region from the inner city, one of their responses is, I don't see any Blacks around me, and we're here. We're either don't look like you, or we're hidden. We self-segregate because, unfortunately, racism still exists, even in communities that we have been in for many, many generations.
Well, and I'm learning more and more about history in Eastern Kentucky, Eastern Tennessee, Western North Carolina, which seems to have been sort of the bedrock of these early Melungeon communities. And the fact that we would have today this history still being uncovered. So where we are in terms of our history and our background, let's talk a little bit about the Free State of Franklin, which we featured in our opening, which I think many people today probably don't even understand the Free State of Franklin. But after looking at this history, I can't help but think maybe one of the reasons they wanted to be the free state was because of the Melungeon mix. What are your views on that? I have no evidence of it because I've never researched this area, but I think it is an area that needs to be looked into. Was this a goal of the Free State to be able to be there as a triracial mix of people?
I kind of have my doubts that the people who were pushing for the state of Franklin really cared too much about the Melungeons. They certainly didn't care about the Native Americans who lived here, because one of the big purposes behind the state of Franklin to begin with was to take advantage of the fact that they were no longer bound by the British treaties that restricted migration west of the Appalachian Mountains. So they were looking to establish themselves in this first state west of the mountains. I think that they did not intend to share this with the people who were already here, and I don't really think that they had planned on making it any sort of a haven for mixed ethnic people. But as it is, the state of Franklin failed, but when the state of Tennessee was created, their constitution did give the vote to all free men. Unfortunately, not women, but all free men had the right to vote. And I think there had to have been some sort of a positive feeling going on that I don't know if who they thought they were going to be talking about, but they certainly did make that available. And as soon as they revised the Constitution in 1836, they closed that. But in the beginning, they did have that there, and I don't think it was an accident.
Well, I'm wondering, because this was also a large Quaker area, and Quakers had begun from the very beginning of freeing slaves, many of them remaining in that Piedmont, North Carolina area, not willing to move further west. So the Quakers, including one of those very popular Jonesboro families, the Embry family, who became part of this idea of creating a safe haven for the free African Americans who were in the region, who you've heard both Lynn and Tony mention as operators on the Underground Railroad. So until 1834, free Blacks in East Tennessee could vote, which, you know, as you mentioned, they had that right stripped away. But very early on, there seems to have been some effort and I think Quakers had a lot to do with that, some effort to include African Americans as members of the voting public. And the same thing in, I think in West Virginia, they may have also had some freedoms of voting. And in Kentucky, further west, they had the right and then had it taken away about the same time. So this idea of creating an identity that became white over time, and why it was not popular to mention this triracial mix. So as we go and we talk about the culture, if someone wanted to visit or learn more about the Melungeon culture in East Tennessee or Southern Ohio, what do you recommend to them? How would you recommend people get more into this story?
Well,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, they're not going to find it routinely at a library. I think accessing the information that Tony and Wayne have to offer, as well as going into regional library research, is where you might find something that makes a difference in your knowledge base. When I was trying to research some of my dad's stories, knowing now that they had some connection to history, even here in Columbus, Ohio, the main libraries don't have that much information.
Is that also your experience, Tony? Just limited resources?
It is, and I mean, I have a stack of articles and as well as books. So I've collected a gross amount of literature, but there are organizations such as the Multicultural Genealogical Center in Chester Hill, which again, Chester Hill is a Quaker settlement, and connected to Underground Railroad. You have the Nelson T. Gant Foundation. You have the Belpre Historical Society that still have a wing of their library dedicated to the research of late Henry Burke. You have other colleges, Marietta College, who have a great amount of literature connected to the Underground Railroad and people of color in that area, the Harrison family, the Harris family. So you have a lot of, it's one of the things where you have a lot of doors, but you have to find, as Lynn mentioned, you have to find those keys with people who have those keys to unlock those doors for you. That's always been that way. And another source would be the Wilbert Siebert Index. If you don't know who Wilbert Siebert, he was a OSU history professor in early 1900s. He wanted to grasp that history of the Underground Railroad. So he had his students work on a project to try to interview the remaining descendants or those who participated in Underground Railroad. And he has a vast collection of interviews, and, you know, not just Ohio, but you have Pennsylvania, you have Tennessee, you have all the way to New York and Indiana. So it's a great resource to have, but from my experience, only two libraries in Ohio have that, and that's the Ohio Historical Society and Ohio University in Athens have that on microfilm for you to research. So,
right. And for those places, you have to make an appointment to even get to those resources. And today with COVID, probably not a good time to begin, but they do have the research guides online if people are interested. And Wayne, you've actually written on this. So share with our viewers how you went about collecting information for your 2 books.
Well, there are no central places to find the information. You can find it scattered all about. But I did find that going to Hancock County, there are a couple places there. The Hancock County Historical Society, which is in the old jail in Sneedville, had a lot of interesting things. And the Vardy Community Historical Society, which is on the north side of Newman's Ridge, just about 8 miles away from the courthouse in Sneedville. There is a museum there that kind of commemorates the old Presbyterian mission, the church and the school that they had there, providing educational opportunity for Melungeons at a time when they weren't permitted to go to the public schools. And there's a lot of information to be had there. It's, it really kind of adds a layer to your knowledge that you find elsewhere when you can go to that source and find things that are a little bit closer to home.
And I would also encourage all of you to talk to your family, talk to your ancestor. That I wanted to end with this, but I'm going to go now. There's an African proverb says, "Once an elder dies, the library burns to the ground." So we live in a time where technology is so mass, and we could do many things as we're doing now in recording it. So take advantage of those opportunities to interview your grandmother, even your mother and father, and discuss these things. Go to family reunions once COVID ends, and go to family reunions and take advantage of these opportunities. Because what I found researching my mass amount of family, the Norris, the Mills, and Goins, and I could go on and on, the Normans and the Letts, and every family had the story of when they became mixed, so to speak. And if we get time, I'll share some of these, but we all have that story. And the story, that's what's so great about Appalachia. I'm not just talking about Melungeons in Appalachia or people of color in Appalachia. The same goes with European whites in Appalachia. It's a storytelling region. Don't let those stories die. Pass them on.
Thank you. And that was exactly, thank you, because you were going to say what I was going to say. This is the aspect of our history that's been unexplored, which is kind of the purpose of this project. And hopefully to encourage people to talk to family members, because if we don't record this history in the region, it's gone.
Yes.
I just so regret not having this information to interview my mom and learn more about her mother, who was a Choctaw, and where this term red bone comes from. And I feel so crazy now that I don't have that opportunity anymore.
And honestly, Dr. Shirley, the story needs to be told by us, not by someone else.
Well, based on what I hear everyone saying, I think we're the only ones who can tell it, because
True. Yeah.
There are no other resources out there. Probably Wayne has made a wonderful contribution to getting people started. But if you were to just interview, we're talking about Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio, but what about Alabama and Georgia and North Carolina, where you have these Melungeon settlements? How much of that history don't we have? And because we don't talk about Cherokee history at all, at least they didn't when I was in school, there's probably lots of information contained within the Cherokee Nation that we need to know more about.
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm going to look in our chat to see what questions people are sending to us, and begin with a question, and I'll open this up to whoever feels comfortable answering. Does Ancestry DNA test show Melungeon? So if you had a DNA test, is there a Melungeon category?
There is not.
No.
It can tell you various components of what people might think is the genetic background of Melungeons, but no reputable company is going to tell you that you have Melungeon ancestry. That's just, they don't really know what all the components might be, what that would look like. I've had several people back before DNA tests were commercially available, I had several researchers asking for DNA samples, and I gave several, heard back from a couple of them, but you know, it's a confusing lot of information that you get from some of the DNA tests. It tells you what it tells you, and it doesn't tell you what it can't tell you. That's I think that it's useful in putting together family trees. It's not going to really answer all your questions, but maybe some of them.
Yeah, as Wayne mentioned, I wanted to give my opinion with this, and I think Lynn has an opinion as well. When my family members ask, should they get DNA testing, my answer is always no. And I'll tell you the reason why. At Ohio University, I met the geneticist. He came to speak to the students that assisted Henry Louis Gates, which Henry Louis Gates is a family member of the Males, by the way, who assisted Henry Louis Gates and Oprah Winfrey connecting their DNA ancestry to the continent of Africa. Well, him and I had a discussion afterwards, and we discussed mixed race people. And he has confided in me and told me that DNA is not absolute, because what you'll find, and even in these locations that it puts you in, people migrated for centuries. They migrated, so it's not going to get to a specific location. And to me, that kind of watered down the whole aspect of storytelling of oral history. In my opinion only, I would be more to relay or depend on oral history than I would DNA testing.
I agree totally, because those stories have been passed down for generations.
Yes.
And there is some truth behind them. As I said, I'm thinking of a story as a legend, and here there is a reality to it that actually traces to someone in Tony's family gathering the stories too. My father never said where he heard it, but it stuck with me. And I think that's more important than the DNA testing. For health reasons, my sister and I had DNA tests done, and I was hoping that I'd get back to Africa, but it didn't happen. According to the percentages, I'm predominantly Native American, while my sister, taking the test at the same time, taking her own unique test, the boat seemed to go back to the British Isles for her. So I don't think those are necessarily reliable sources for the stories that we want as the foundation for our families.
And Lynn, you make a good point, because I think the other aspect of DNA testing that isn't always shared is that you can be from the same family and your DNA percentages can be entirely different.
Absolutely.
And so even though you're blood related, what percentage of your parents' DNA you actually get could tell a different story for each person, which, maybe as time goes on, it might get better. But for right now, it's an inaccurate marker for many people. But also, I think it's important, based on how the story's been told, you have to understand that the Spanish, when they were exploring, they had quite a few African American sailors and colonizationists who were part of it. And a lot of those early Spanish settlers were from East Africa, from Portugal. They had those blood mixes too. So you don't quite get a Central Africa story. They would have been considered mixed race even in that time period. They would have been mixed race. So I have another question from a viewer. It says, my European ancestors hail from Meat Gap in Watauga, North Carolina. I hope that's how you say it. A land early settlers stole from natives for its natural salt deposits. I'm having trouble finding the mixing of Blacks and natives in East Tennessee and Western North Carolina. Where can they go for help?
For the story of it, or
trying to find the history of it? That's one of those questions. I'll jump in on that. I think your local history, your local heritage societies who do history of your region would be a good place to start. I don't know much about the Western North Carolina heritage societies, but I have to believe there's some that do exist. Does anyone, Wayne, do you have any information on that?
Not really. I would suggest to add to the sources you related, I would suggest churches, particularly Black churches that had been around for a while. They might have some history that they could pass on as well.
Okay. Another viewer wants to know if any of our panelists have heard about the Plecker letters and their impact on the Melungeon community.
Yes, so Dr. Walter Plecker was the registrar of vital statistics in Virginia during the time of the Racial Integrity Act. In fact, he was one of the people who pushed very hard to get the Racial Integrity Act passed. And at one point, he sent a letter to Mrs. I believe the name is Mrs. John Trotwood Moore at the Tennessee State Library, and he was asking for information about the Melungeons. He wanted to make sure that he was not missing anyone when he sent out letters to all the county clerks in Virginia, telling them, look for people with these surnames. They are colored, passing as white, or attempting to pass as white, and we are going to make sure that does not happen. He sent He sent a letter to the state librarian in Tennessee, asking about people of these surnames that were associated with Melungeons, and you can tell that she was kind of reluctant to answer, but she did, and told him what she could about the Melungeons. And what she told him was enough for him. He basically said, yes, we're going to categorize all these people who have these surnames as colored. So people would go to the courthouse and apply for a marriage license, and county clerks were supposed to say, no, not you. You cannot marry this person. So that's how it affected people in the real world. But the letters that Plecker wrote, there would be two different ones. The ones he wrote, the correspondence that he had with the Tennessee librarian, and the letters that he sent out to the county clerks in Virginia.
Wow, that sounds like pretty serious work.
Yeah, those contain lists of names, and that's been one of the clues that people look at. If any of their family surnames are on that list, then that gives them an idea of what the status of their relatives might have been. It's a clue. It's not an answer necessarily, but it gives people a clue.
And where are these Plecker letters, and how to get people gain access to them if they would like?
You look them up online. You'll find them online easily. Just put Walter Plecker letters, and you should find everything that I've just referred to. Okay.
Tony, the next question has to do with you. The writer wants to know, do you have that list or description, paper document that you held up with the names? How do people gain access to that if they wanted to see your list?
Do you mind if I put it up now? Quickly?
Sure.
And I could send it to them as well, but this is, and I'll do it quickly. This is some of the names, and you see this actually happened with a project with Ohio University. It was called the African American Presence in the Ohio River Valley, and what the project goal was to connect the land in Wayne National Forest to people of color. So what we found out is that a lot of people of color own land in that area, and of course it was taken away through the years. So these are the connections that we made, and you can see some of the names. Some are quite familiar. If you look at the male name, we have many different spellings of the male last name, and that had a lot to do with not passing, identifying as another race by changing the name. And I will stop here, but yeah, if you just send me a message, Dr. Turley should have my contact information, then I'll get you the list.
Right, and Tony, if you are open to it, we can provide a list of that list in our toolkit. So if people want to have access to it, and I'll say this to anyone else on the panel, if you have things that you would like for us to share within our toolkit, we're more than happy to do it.
Thank you.
I have a PhD student who has a concentration on multiracial people in West North Carolina, Tennessee, and Ohio. And they are saying, I have found DNA and marriage links between a group of West North Carolina families and families in Hancock County and Vinton County, Ohio. So I have also been some evidence of Melungeon floaters, or men that move from community to community. Have any of you found any information that may have been linked to these early settlements? So he's Hancock County, definitely you do, Wayne, but what about Vinton County, Ohio?
Well, those were places where Melungeon families may have migrated to in the 1800s, maybe the late 1800s. There were more and more families coming in all the time, and there wasn't, of course, there wasn't enough tillable land for everyone, so people might stay for a while and move on looking for other places. But yeah, there was always a lot of traffic back and forth. People moved back to an area where they had lived earlier. So you kind of find a trail, kind of a migration trail. Jack Goins of Rogersville has done a magnificent job of tracing individual families from Virginia and North Carolina into Tennessee. And that trail leads many, many families out of Tennessee into Kentucky, Ohio, Michigan, all different places. So Jack Goins' work has a lot of the detail in it that he spent a lot of time in courthouses looking through some dusty old work is invaluable. People who are doing genealogy on groups that pass through Hawkins and Hancock County, Tennessee, particularly.
How much do you think this migratory pattern has to do with people just trying to escape racial oppression? Are people moving further? It seems to be moving further west, further north. Are they being pushed, or are they going on their own volition? What do you think?
A little of both, I would say. When you lived in Hancock County and the people there considered you a Melungeon, that was really going to limit your opportunities. Even if you went to get an education, when you come back, it's kind of an uphill struggle. I had the privilege of knowing people who did that and made good lives for themselves, but there wasn't really room for a lot of ambitious people. And if you had a name or were associated with Melungeon families, you were just going to do better going somewhere else where they didn't know about that. They hadn't ever heard of Melungeons, and you weren't going to be suspect because of your name. People might have questions about your skin color, but people from Appalachia came in all different shades, and up north people didn't seem to notice that so much. So I think the racial aspect was very important. Then the economic aspect, of course, there were better jobs up north, and better farmland up north. So people had a lot of motivation to move on.
And a similar thing happened with the Male family and the Norris family, a majority from Barber County, West Virginia, or Philippi, West Virginia, and they migrated, not just, I call it a racial migration, not just because of racism, but also employment as well, but also being in a community where you're not judged immediately, where you don't have that family history that's there. And I'm not saying family history is bad, but that negative views or stereotypes in the local communities.
Wow. So, Wayne, they would like for you to give the name of Dr. Kennedy's book again.
His name is The Melungeons, The Resurrection of a Proud People. It's published by Mercer University Press, 1994.
Okay, and again, we will list these resources in our toolkit. Interesting to have books that are credible that folks can read about. And so another question, has anyone come across any textiles related specifically to Melungeon families? Is there any particular textile patterns that you're aware of?
Not anything that is out of the ordinary from what you would find in Appalachian families generally. I'm thinking of quilts and things like that primarily. And I think that just comes out of the tradition of living in Appalachia. A lot of cultural ideas seem to get mixed up right at the very beginning of Appalachia. A lot of different influences were blended together. And I think that created sort of its own little subcategory. So I haven't ever been aware of anything along those lines that was specifically Melungeon, more Appalachian.
Right. But I think too, if you're talking about the blending of cultures, if you look at some of the textile art of Appalachia, I think this is why it is so universal, because within it, you see Native American, you see Scotch, Irish, British, African art, all intertwined within the Appalachian, what's clearly defined
And
as,
music as well.
as an Appalachian cultural quilt might make more sense now if you understand the history.
That's right.
What were you going to say, Tony? I'm sorry.
I was saying music as well.
Oh,
Definitely.
we have not touched on that.
Yeah, yeah.
And certainly storytelling and music as a big part of what makes, maybe this is what really makes Appalachia distinctive. What do you think?
Well, when I started out as a storyteller, and I apologize, my Wi-Fi went out, I had to get it back. When I started out as a storyteller, and I told some Jack tales, there were people of European American heritage who wanted to know why I wasn't telling African stories. And I would try to explain to them that although I have such stories in my family and I have researched them, the Jack tales were the ones that I heard as I was growing up, more so than any others, those types of tales. By limiting, because of who they thought I should be, they were actually stunting my career. You know, I couldn't get a job at a festival where the banjo pickers were predominantly European American, just because they didn't think that a Black person could tell tales of Jack.
Wow. Again, being limited and defined. So we have one of the questions is, what specific lessons or anecdotes might each of you share from your work to help our divided political tribes address the deep wounds of race in America?
I would have
What-
to say, pass those stories on. I can't stress this enough. Pass those stories on, because we begin to heal as a Melungeon. I'm using that term vaguely, but how we identify, we begin to heal once we share those stories. Our ancestors come back and are with us. The more we share these stories, and we share them with our children and pass it on.
Pass it on. Wayne
Yeah.
or Lynn?
I would agree. It's tell your children about it. My son was telling me the other day, you know, I've heard that story 100 times. I said, you'll probably hear it 100 more. But you'll be telling it to your children too.
Exactly. It gives them roots. And I keep saying foundation. We need those foundations. Look at what young people have gone through now that we thought would be left behind after the 60s. Stories, the oldest stories, going to the elders and gathering those stories. Foundation is so important, but also there's a connection to history besides the connection to heritage. And that makes it important for young people to realize, oh yes, my family went through this, and I am the result of their dreams and their goals. That helps them to get through the times that we've been having now.
And just think, some of the stories we're sharing, some are from this early 1800s or even the late 1700s that we continue to share about our families. Just think how long they've lasted and will continue to last.
And some of the folk tales in my family can be traced right back to the west coast of Africa. But if I had not heard them and remembered them, because they weren't written down, I wouldn't be able to say that to my children.
Yes, yes.
And the fact that we still struggle with oral history being seen as a valid form of preservation of history. And if Appalachia, this is another reason why storytelling in the region is so important. So much of the Appalachian history is enveloped in those stories that if they're not captured and explored like Wayne has done and like each of you have done through your own personal histories, we wouldn't be able to even tell this story today. We would still be wondering about it. So,
Dr. Turley, you make a good point. When that project I mentioned earlier with Ohio University, first there was a stop because in higher education, they want scholarly research and books and so on. And I had to remind them where we are. And then they finally agreed to do the storytelling interviews and so on and so forth.
right. Even my own family history, which is connected now, I am learning with Red Bones. My mom's mother was Choctaw. And this whole part of her history, we know so little about. And so I have become now committed to this idea of knowing more about that aspect of her history that she didn't feel comfortable really sharing or talking about, which I think is terrible, that there are aspects of your identity that you feel you cannot openly share. So we're kind of running out of time. So I want to take this opportunity to thank each one of our panelists for this wonderful discussion and to encourage everyone to visit. If you missed today's discussion or if you had difficulty hearing my beginning, I just want to let everyone know this is our last Freedom Stories for the year. We are signing off again until January 9th of 2021 to begin our second series of 6 public discussions. We'll be doing it the same way, same media outlets, same time, 1 to 2:30 p.m. We will be joining with post-Civil War discussions about the rise of American Jim Crow, and particularly and how it presented itself in Appalachia. So we're hoping to have, again, the same type of wonderful panel that you've experienced today. So I do appreciate everyone listening. Any closing comments from anyone? We've got about 3 minutes.
I just want to thank everybody, and it's so wonderful to get to know people who are like-minded and trying to keep the family heritage within the view of others.
Thank you, Lynn.
I would just like to
Anyone?
thank all of you as well, and I'm happy to meet all of you and hopefully get to know each other further in the future. But I remind all of you that as we go for the holidays, leave for the holiday to meet family, that's your chance. That's your chance to start recording those histories, sharing those stories. So don't let me down.
Certainly, if we're going to know this history, it needs to happen now, right? Wayne.
Yes, that's true. That's very true. And you can become a hero in your own family if you will make a recording. Of the elders. Make sure you get their words recorded. Not everyone in the family was there in the room when that story was being told, but you can share that, you can pass that on. Technology makes that very easy these days. It just takes the bare minimum of planning, just finding the right moment. And I found that people love to tell their story. They love to pass on that information to younger people.
And as an academic, I'm going to say, if you're a professor out there looking for a research topic, you just heard a wonderful research topic for your PhD or your senior level students. I encourage you to push it, try to get it in our history books so that we can recreate a more accurate history, American history. So until we are together again after the holidays, please take care of yourselves and please join us in January for our Freedom Stories to kick off 2021. Thank you.
Thank you.